So we all remember the Hobbit movies, right? The bad ones. Remember how much they disappointed you? How much dumb stuff was added in? All the bad CGI? The extra villains? The fact that there's 3 of them? This f***ing guy? Well, I've come to make an announcement. Your days of disappointment are over. Kind of. I wrote a 2-part movie adaptation of The Hobbit, and you can read it for the low, low price of $0. The finished scripts are both up on a Google Drive, which I've linked to in the description. But whether you decide to read it or not, I wanted to make this video to talk through my process of adapting the book, because it was a really interesting experience that I learned a lot from. Also, Lindsay Ellis and Just Right both made super comprehensive Hobbit videos back in the day, and this was the only way for me to one-up them. I say that as a big fan of both of them, like, no shade intended at all, it's just, you guys set the bar really high. I'm basically going to spoil my entire adaptation in this video, and I'm going to go through all the changes I made from the book, so keep that in mind. You might want to watch this first to see if reading it is going to be worth your time, or you might want to read it first to experience it fresh, and then come watch this later to hear my process. But I'm going to go through a few different areas that I found notable and challenging in writing this, and just talk through my process and why I made the choices that I did. I'm also going to talk about this in a way that assumes that everyone watching is familiar with at least one version of this story, whether that's the book, the Rankin and Bass cartoon, the 3 Peter Jackson movies, or my 2 scripts. So, here we go. Hope you enjoy it. So, the unexpected party was, no pun intended, an unexpected challenge. Almost all the major exposition for the story happens here, and it introduces most of the main characters. There's basically only 2 options in how I could do it. Either follow the book faithfully and introduce all the dwarves in small groups as they arrive, or do what the animated movie does and just have them all show up at once. I chose to stick closer to the book, and it was definitely a challenge to get through all 13 dwarves and give them somewhat distinctive introductions. After the dwarves get introduced, there's a lot of exposition, and most of it is stuff that can't really be skipped or postponed to later. So my version is not line for line exactly as it is in the book, but I stuck pretty close to it. I tried to keep that part short, but it still took about 30 pages to get through. For those of you who aren't familiar with screenplay format, conventional wisdom says that 1 page of a script equals 1 minute of screen time. Granted, in this case there's a lot of dialogue in that sequence, and a lot of detailed character descriptions when I introduce each dwarf. So if it was actually shot, I expect it might turn out to be more like 20 minutes of runtime, but it's still a decent sized sequence. Another thing that I quickly found out would be a challenge to work with was the dwarves. I've always been disappointed that the movies don't give us more characterization for a lot of the dwarves. And initially, I wanted to do better with making them all somewhat distinct. But I quickly realized that doing so would be very impractical. 13 characters is too many for a story of this length to fully do justice to, amid all the other things and characters that it's trying to balance. And the book tells us basically nothing about most of them, and usually treats them as a group rather than individuals. So I decided to choose a few dwarves to focus on, and have moments in the first movie where Bilbo forms a bond with them. Dori is said to be the strongest dwarf, and I decided that he also looks out for the others in the company the most. Dori carries Bilbo through the goblin tunnels, and Bilbo grabs onto him when the eagles rescue them later. In the book, Dori does this begrudgingly, but I thought it would be good to make him choose to look out for Bilbo in those moments. So I put a slightly different angle on those 2 beats, and then added a couple others for him. Bombur is another dwarf that I had build a dynamic with Bilbo throughout part 1. The book reduces him to the fat dwarf. Like, really, it's the only characteristic Tolkien gave him. And I wanted to write him better than that. I had a dynamic develop between him and Bilbo where they bond over missing home, and there's a couple smaller moments where I indicate that they stay near each other throughout the journey. I had Dwalin train Bilbo to fight. That thread doesn't take up too much time, but when they get to the trolls, I have Dwalin find Sting and give it to Bilbo, and there's just a couple small moments that indicate that he trains Bilbo with it. Then I had a different conflict with the dwarves develop in part 2 with Thorin, Balin, Fili, and Kili. Balin is one of the few characters that I think the live-action movies treat pretty well, and I definitely pulled from that version by making him Thorin's main advisor, as well as one of the dwarves that becomes closer to Bilbo. That advisor role comes more into play in part 2, especially since he, Dwalin, and Thorin are the only dwarves who had lived in Erebor before Smaug came. At least in my version and the live-action ones. I don't know if that's officially canon. Fili and Kili are confirmed in the book to be Thorin's nephews, and I stole an idea from Just Right's video by having Thorin prepare them to be his heirs as king. So in part 2, I had the two of them be in conflict over how the dwarves should deal with the Lakemen and the elves. Kili generally sides with Thorin in distrusting them and refusing to give them any of the treasure, while Fili and Balin are more in favor of being generous and trying to build alliances and trust with them. This results in one of the biggest changes from the book that I made. I'm jumping the gun a little, but in the final battle in the book, Fili and Kili both die defending Thorin, who also dies after the battle. But I decided to change that in my version and have Thorin die defending them and pass on the kingdom to both of them. And in his last words to them, he tells them to balance each other in how they rule and not be too isolationist like he was, but not be too trusting either. That felt like a stronger ending to me than having all three of them die in battle, but I understand if some people don't like that I made a pretty direct deviation from the original text. In general, I found it a bit challenging to choose which random dwarf to give a task or a line to. The only one that I gave any kind of deliberate personality to, aside from the ones that I've already talked about, was Gloin. There's a couple moments in the book, especially at the beginning, where he is the most vocally doubtful of Bilbo, so I decided to have him do that more consistently throughout. Otherwise, I didn't really bother building out much character for the other dwarves. I described them all to be physically distinct, and tried not to do anything inconsistent with them. As much as I think it would have been nice to build out distinct personalities for all of them, I didn't feel like it was worthwhile to spend time building deep characters for random dwarves like Bofur and Nori, since there just wasn't room for them to do anything significant. Any story has a max capacity of characters that it can develop based on length, and Tolkien clearly didn't think he had time to do that for all 13 dwarves in a 300-page book. So I thought it was better to pick a few of them to focus on, rather than try to give them all equal attention and spread things too thin. The spider battle was a scene that I really wanted to do justice to. This whole idea actually started just as a video about the spider battle, and the way the live-action movie handles it terribly. For my money, that scene is maybe the most important one in the entire story. Over the years, I've realized that The Hobbit is largely a story about Bilbo doing increasingly more courageous acts. Most of the major beats of the story are about Bilbo choosing to do something that scares him. And the spider battle is arguably the most important of those. At that point, he's had a nearly disastrous failure with the trolls, escaped the goblin tunnels by himself, and faced down some other harrowing situations in between. But the spider battle takes things a step further than the previous trials did. He doesn't just have to escape the spiders on his own like he did with Gollum. He has to save the dwarves totally by himself. It's a huge turning point for him. It's the first time he does something that makes him feel courageous, and the first time that the dwarves really accept him as a valuable member of the company. Which is why I hate that the live-action movies completely throw that aside by having the elves rescue them from the spiders instead. To give them some credit, the first movie tries to create a similar moment where Bilbo saves Thorin from Azog at the burning trees, but it doesn't accomplish the same things that the spider battle does. I really tried to do that scene justice. I hope I did. I think it turned out pretty good, and I would love to see it filmed because I just think it would be a great battle scene. But I was also very intentional about where I placed it in the story, which leads us to the next point. Saying that The Hobbit should have been 2 movies instead of 3 is a pretty cold take. As many of you probably know, it was supposed to be 2 movies initially. But even if it's an obvious choice, it was still important to put it into practice in a way that splits the stories in a narratively coherent way. Ever since I first heard the movies were happening, I always felt that the spider battle should be the end of part 1. As a kid, I only said that because it happens in the middle of the book and is a big action scene. And even now, I'll cite that as part of the reason I did it. But because the spider battle is such a big moment for Bilbo, I thought it made a great end to his arc for part 1. The spider battle is not the last courageous action Bilbo takes in the story, but after that he starts to move through the world with much more confidence and becomes a leader among the dwarves. And after that point, there are other leader characters that get introduced, so I thought that was a good way to divide the movies thematically. The first movie is about courage, and the second movie is about leadership. Bilbo is basically just trying to keep up with the dwarves in the first half and faces some situations by himself, but in the second half he saves them and takes the lead in several cases. In the second half, there's also a triangle of leaders that are in conflict, with Thorin, the Lake Master, and the Elf King, And then paired with them, you have servant leader characters in Bard and Bilbo, and even Gandalf to an extent, as well as an original character that I'll get to in a minute. So I decided to really highlight that distinction with those characters, and show Bilbo and Bard leading effectively by example and taking initiative without lording power over anyone like the other three leaders do at several points. And when Thorin chooses to join the battle at the end, I tried to frame that as him stepping up as a leader by risking his life for the future of Erebor. So tied into where I split the movies is Bilbo's arc. One of the most echoed criticisms of the live-action movies is that the second and third basically make Bilbo a side character in his own story. And I will echo that criticism again here. So I really wanted to make sure that my adaptation delivered on being Bilbo's story. Basically, he has a positive change arc in Part 1, where he learns to be courageous throughout the earlier trials of the adventure, and in Part 2 he has a flat arc where he changes the world around him, but doesn't go through as much change himself. I still wanted to highlight some moments of courage in Part 2, especially when he first enters the mountain to confront Smaug. But even pivotal moments of bravery like that in the second half don't change Bilbo's view of himself the same way that the spider battle or his confrontation with Gollum do. So I didn't try to show them through that lens quite as much. And thankfully, Tolkien did me a lot of favors in that regard. There's a pretty clear difference to how Bilbo acts in the book before and after the spider battle, so it wasn't hard to have that translate into my version. But something I paid a lot of attention to in Part 1 is making sure that I framed the events of the story around Bilbo's arc. There's stuff built into each moment in the original text, but I think the speed that the animated movie goes at makes some of those moments lose their weight, and the extra stuff the live-action movies cram in pulls focus away from those moments. For instance, the troll scene is Bilbo's first test, and he steps outside of his comfort zone, but still screws up pretty badly. And I don't feel like either movie version of that scene really makes you think of that moment in those terms. So in moments where I stayed close to the book, I wanted to take every possible opportunity to give Bilbo character-defining moments and keep him as the central focus. Probably my favorite original moment that I wrote for Bilbo's arc was a scene between him and Elrond in Rivendell. I won't go into full detail because you can just go read it, but my intention with that scene was to make it feel more like Bilbo continuing the journey beyond that point is a choice rather than an obligation. It's not really framed this way in the book, but I feel like Rivendell signals a point of no return for Bilbo. He could choose to stay there for a while or go back home by himself and give up on the quest. They make that much more explicit with Frodo in Lord of the Rings, but I think it applies to Bilbo's journey too. So I wanted to subtly give voice to that. Hopefully it came across. There were a couple moments near the end of the book that really stood out to me as I was finishing Part 2 that I never fully appreciated before. After the final battle, Bilbo has a line to himself. I'll put it on screen here. I think it's a really nice touch that Tolkien manages to highlight the amount of difference that even the smallest person can make in a huge conflict, but also takes the care to show that even with the best intentions and most selfless actions, Bilbo can't prevent the battle or Thorin's death. I really hope that any of you who read it feel like I did his arc justice, because it's a really excellent arc in the book, and it was my top priority in this adaptation. So unfortunately, I decided not to include Gandalf's side quest, which is disappointing to me, but I stand by that choice. Even though I don't especially like the way they do those scenes in the live-action movies, I've always wanted to see them, because it was always a little dissatisfying to me that Gandalf just nopes out of the quest with very little explanation, and has what sounds like a cool solo adventure. The live-action movies screwed it up by trying to do too much Lord of the Rings prequel stuff, although, in fairness, the books textually confirm that Gandalf's side quest does relate to Sauron's return. But the problem with trying to fit it into an adaptation of The Hobbit is that it truly is a side quest. It has no relevance to the main plot of the story. I think trying to fit that in here would have felt like what they did in the Amazing Spider-Man movies with Peter investigating what happened to his dad. It's interesting extra lore in theory, but it doesn't really connect to the main plot of the story in practice. So what I did instead is just make sure to tease Gandalf's departure at a couple points earlier in the first movie. I have a couple lines between him and Elrond when they arrive in Rivendell, and then have Beorn pull him aside a couple scenes before he leaves the company. It's just those two small moments, but I think it's enough to foreshadow it within the text of that movie. I'm disappointed that I couldn't include that, because part of me still wants to see a better version of that side quest than what the movies gave us. But the further I got into the second movie, and the more I thought about how I could justify it, the less sense it made. So I thought it was cleaner to just cut it and have Gandalf leave near the end of Part 1, and not really show up again until the battle at the end of Part 2. Edrahil is the original character that I mentioned a couple sections ago, and she was one of the biggest challenges in writing this. In keeping with the theme of leadership that I built for the second movie, I thought it would be good to have a character to contrast Thranduil the Elf King, so I wrote him a sister. Initially I was going to have her be his wife, but they're at odds with each other the entire movie, so I thought sister worked better, because she could still defy him without getting in as much trouble as some random elf would, but she doesn't wield the same level of authority. I set her up as somebody who, like Bilbo and Bard, leads by example among the elves, and has a good relationship with a lot of the lower-ranking people in the Elf Kingdom, and is very willing to resist or criticize people in power. Functionally, I had her serve a few different roles. She helps Bilbo free the dwarves from Thranduil's prison, and goes to investigate rumors of the Goblin army moving to Erebor after Smaug's death, and then eventually warn the other armies about them. I also had her be able to speak to birds, and use that to keep tabs on what's happening in the wider world. So when Smaug dies, she hears about it, and that's how she's alerted to go investigate the goblins mobilizing. And it also sets up the element of Bard being able to hear the thrush that tells him about Smaug's weak spot later. So ultimately, Edrahil was very useful for addressing some plot conveniences that are in the book and making them feel more justified, and I think she adds to the leadership theme pretty well. But there was a minute where I decided to cut her entirely. Tauriel in the live-action movies proves that having an original elf woman just for the sake of it is not a smart move, so I wanted to make sure that I didn't fall into that trap. Initially, I just had a fun dialogue scene with her and Thranduil, and then had her help Bilbo free the dwarves, but then I couldn't figure out what else to do with her for a long time. Even after finding some other roles for her to fill, it was difficult to come up with some later moments for her to give her plot thread some satisfying closure. It's up to your judgment whether I did that successfully, but I'm mostly happy with her inclusion in scenes, and I think she ultimately enhances the story. I could have written it without her, but I think it's better that she's there. So a big lesson that I learned for adaptation is that adding a character can be useful if the original story has some problems. I don't think it's always the right call, and you don't need to look any further than all of the original characters in the live-action Hobbit movies for proof of that. It's obviously a case-by-case thing. Adding a character isn't always a good solution, and you have to pull it off in practice. But if I'm ever tasked with adapting anything else, it's a tool I'm going to keep in mind. I didn't change much in terms of how the Arkenstone is included in the story, but it was a bit of a challenge to figure out when and how to introduce it. I don't love how any of the other three versions handle it. The book doesn't introduce it until the dwarves have already claimed the treasure after Smaug's death, which is pretty late to introduce a MacGuffin. But it also isn't relevant at all until that point, so I don't fault Tolkien there, because it would have been hard to make it come up naturally before then. The animated version just completely cuts it out, which I guess works about as much as all the other corners that the animated movie cuts, but it's a pretty glaring omission considering how crucial it is to the book. But the live-action movies make what I consider to be a worse choice. It's included at the very beginning of the first movie, but of course it doesn't really matter until they reach the Lonely Mountain, and from there it stays pretty faithful to the book. But the Arkenstone is also framed in those movies as this object of temptation similar to the One Ring in Lord of the Rings, and they really double down with that choice by expanding it out to dragon sickness that infects Thorin as he spends more time with the treasure. So, I didn't reinvent the wheel in my version, but I thought I found a cleaner way to do it. I basically stick to how the book uses it, but introduce it a little earlier than the book does, just before the dwarves find the secret entrance. So Thorin tells Bilbo to try to find it when he initially enters the mountain, and then it pretty much stays the same as the book from there. I won't claim that as a perfect inclusion of it, but I think I introduced it early enough in the second movie that it doesn't come out of nowhere like in the book, but also doesn't get treated with too much importance like the live-action movies. There were basically two major choices to make with Bard. The first is, do you introduce him when the dwarves first get to Lake Town, or right before he kills Smaug like the book does? When I saw the trailer for Desolation of Smaug and it showed us that Bard was going to get introduced earlier, I thought that was a smart call. In practice, I hate the Bard storylines in those movies. But I still think in isolation it's a good idea to introduce him earlier, and I did that in my version. I don't have Bard do much in his introduction, he just has a brief conversation with Bilbo while he helps fit him with some armor. But since Smaug's death comes about halfway through Part 2, I thought that was too late to introduce one of the major players of the second movie. And I thought it was useful to give Bilbo and Bard at least a little familiarity before Bard takes charge of Lake Town. Although I stand by the live-action movie's choice to introduce him earlier, I actually think it would have also been a cool choice to introduce him at the opening of the third movie, since they have Smaug's death be the opening scene. Most of what they do with him in Desolation is stupid and useless, but I think the way they expand the backstory of him being heir to Girion of Dale is actually a smart choice, and explains how he knows Smaug's weakness a lot cleaner than the book does. So that's one of the few choices from the live-action movie I'll defend. And that leads to the second question. How do you make Bard learn about Smaug's weakness before killing him? As I said, the way they do it in the movies isn't a bad choice, but it takes up a lot of time and wouldn't fit well into my version. So initially, I was going to do exactly what the book does, where a thrush hears Bilbo mention Smaug's weakness, and it goes to tell Bard. And I actually stuck pretty close to that, but I tried to do a cleaner job setting it up than the book does. As I mentioned before, Edrahil has a whole communication network with thrushes and ravens in my version, so Bilbo tells the thrush to carry a message to her, but just after that, Smaug attacks. So when the thrush alerts Bard, there's a justification that it was already going that direction to deliver the message from Bilbo, and the audience already knows that there are some people who are born with the ability to hear bird language. It doesn't cover things completely. I think the whole thing with the thrush telling Bard where to aim feels like a deus ex machina no matter how you do it, but I tried to make it feel somewhat more earned and set up in my version. This was a big challenge to adapt. Like most other elements, the two movie adaptations gave me extremely different examples of how to adapt this part. The animated movie rushes through everything in about 3 minutes, and the live-action movie stretches it out over most of the third movie, so obviously neither of those were decisions I wanted to emulate. But the book presents its own problems. The gathering of the cloud section that sets up the necessary elements for the battle to happen is pretty good, and I stuck close to the book for that part. But the battle itself has two major problems. The first is that Bilbo doesn't do anything. He just sits on a hill next to Gandalf for most of it, and then gets knocked out for the second half. In some ways, this is sort of the point of the story. Bilbo isn't a great warrior, and he's already made his most important contributions to the story by that point. But when you spend so long with him as the protagonist, it still feels wrong to have him just sit on the sidelines at the climax. The other problem is bringing Thorin and the other main dwarves into the battle. The way Tolkien does it in the book gives no explanation for why that happens. They just jump in halfway through and rally the defending forces. Tolkien gets away with that because he tells that part of the story from a pretty detached point of view that doesn't really favor any character too much, even Bilbo. But in a movie version, it feels cheap to take almost a sports commentator's view of that moment the way the book does. Especially when we've had 2 full movies with Thorin as a major character, who we're meant to understand and sympathize with. And this is where I actually understand the decision to use dragon sickness as a major element in the live-action movies. Don't get it twisted, it's a bad solution to that problem, and is one of the many stupid things in that last movie. But you have to give some kind of justification for Thorin to stay out of the battle initially and then join it later. That scene where he's standing on the Lake of Gold and having the voices in his head with all the super Dutch angles. It's a dumb scene, but they needed something there, and Tolkien gave them basically nothing to work with. So, how did I get around these problems? Well, after sitting with it for a bit, I realized that maybe I could solve both problems at once. If Bilbo has nothing to do in the battle, and we need a justification for Thorin joining, maybe Bilbo's role could be bringing Thorin into the battle. So I had Dain fall early on in the battle so the dwarves are left without a leader, and Bilbo runs to the front gate to tell Thorin. But this also required building out Thorin's motivations a little more than they are in the book. If Bilbo has to convince Thorin to join the battle, I needed to know how he could reach Thorin in a way that nothing else to that point had. In the book, Thorin is mostly motivated by greed. If you take his motivations as purely selfish, which I think the book does, the best arguments against that greed have already been presented. The Lakemen have pleaded their case in asking for aid, and it's already been stated a few times that Thorin and the other dwarves can be easily starved out of the mountain by the elves and the Lakemen. So I thought it made more sense if Thorin's motivation was to protect his home. The book doesn't highlight this as much, but he's spent something like 50 years away from his home, and now when he's just gotten it back, he has people who want to take part of that wealth. If his motivation for hoarding the gold comes from wanting to protect his home and stay loyal to the company and other dwarves, that motivation is a lot easier to lock into both as a writer and as an audience. So his resistance to join the battle is because he's already sacrificed so much for so long in order to reclaim Erebor, and he doesn't want any of the company to die for it. I won't talk through that whole scene, because you can go read it, but that was the angle I took at it. It isn't quite as clean as I would like it to be, but I'm mostly happy with how I addressed it. To finish out this section, I already talked earlier about how I made Fili and Kili survive. Again, I understand if people aren't happy with that choice, but I stand by it. I basically didn't bother making sure that anything I did was consistent with Tolkien lore outside of the book. You can call me lazy or call me a fake fan for doing that, but I didn't want to get bogged down in all the histories and technicalities of Middle-earth. Tolkien is a great and visionary writer in many regards, but I didn't think it was smart to treat his word as infallible. I've already detailed some places in the book that he didn't necessarily make the best story choices with, but I tried to honor his work as best I could. Even where I didn't adapt the letter of his work faithfully, I tried to adapt the spirit of his work as best I could. And I didn't feel like dipping into the extended lore of his world to use the most precisely accurate terms in all cases. I have no idea how consistent my adaptation is to all the stuff in the appendices and the supplemental texts and histories and whatever else. I also don't care. My goal here was to adapt the book and respect that specific text above all else, and I think I did that successfully. If there's something in the extended lore that any of you think would have made this story legitimately better, I am open to hearing that. But I won't apologize for not bothering to read any extra Tolkien lore to write this adaptation. So before wrapping up, I'll just address some of my general approach to the tone and dialogue. Wherever I felt like pulling from the text word for word was useful, I did. Many of the dialogue scenes that I wrote are condensed versions of what's in the book, where maybe a line or two is copied verbatim, and the rest of it gets the same point across in a different way. I would guess that less than 15% of the dialogue is pulled directly from the book, and 15% might even be highballing it. The two scenes that are most similar are Bilbo's encounters with Gollum and Smaug. And I think that's true of both other adaptations, too. There's not much you really can or should change with those scenes. In terms of character voices, I did my best to keep them consistent and make them somewhat distinct. A lot of that was just vibe-based, but I was somewhat deliberate in how self-serious I wrote some characters to be. I tried to make Thorin and Thranduil sound more self-important and use more big vocab words, and then tried to make Bilbo, Gandalf, Bard, and some of the more prominent dwarves sound more down-to-earth and normal. It's a tricky balance because the way that even Bilbo is written in the book makes him sound pretty formal by today's standards. But there's still a difference you can hear between him and Thorin and other characters. I feel like Bilbo and Gandalf have pretty distinct voices across the books and movies, and I tried to stick with that. Martin Freeman and Ian McKellen give fantastic performances, so I basically wrote the dialogue as if they would be the ones saying it. And even Thorin and Balin's characterization from the live-action versions I think seeped their way into mine. And, tied into that, I tried to keep the tone somewhat consistent with the book. I don't think my version tonally fits as well with the Lord of the Rings movies. I didn't deliberately include that much comedy in this. Certainly there's no character that I wrote to be comic relief. But I stayed open to including some kind of humor, and I think I managed to capture some of the humor from the book, and add in a few more fun moments. I really love writing dialogue. It's one of my favorite things about writing. There weren't many scenes that lend themselves to being great dialogue exchanges in this story, but there's a few that I managed to include. There's two original scenes that I'm happy with just as isolated dialogue scenes. Hopefully they don't come off as too out of place or Sorkin-esque, although I did go very slightly into Sorkin territory a couple times. But given how close I stuck to the book in a broad plot sense, I'm happily surprised with how much original dialogue I was able to write for this adaptation. And again, I was willing to just rip words straight from Tolkien in some places, and hopefully I wasn't too indulgent with adding original dialogue. So those are all the changes that I made, but I want to take a minute to talk about what I learned about the adaptation process here. First of all, I think it gave me a lot more respect for the people who worked on the live-action movies. It doesn't make me enjoy them more, but there were a lot of things that seemed at first glance like they should have been easy to do well, but actually required a lot more creativity and thought than I expected. As I pointed out, it's easy enough to say that dragon sickness is a dumb idea, but it's much harder to find another way to fix the problem that it's trying to address. And in that sense, I want to take a minute to just give everyone who worked on those movies their flowers. I do think my adaptation is better, but I don't want to throw any criticism at the people who actually worked on those movies because of that. They had a lot of factors working against them that I absolutely did not have. Making it 3 movies sounds like it was a studio decision, and by all accounts, there were a lot of issues in production, and Peter Jackson was making those movies largely against his will. A lot of that is well known, but I want to reiterate it. I didn't have to answer to studio notes, I didn't have to hit any deadlines, I got to set these scripts aside for a while and go do other projects and then come back to them later, and I didn't have to go through any hassle involved in actually making it, like scheduling, or budget, or marketing, or contracts, or legal issues, or reshoots. I also had the advantage of seeing the failures of the live-action movies and having some knowledge of what not to do. Sometimes you don't know what doesn't work until you've written it to completion, and they wrote a lot of mistakes to completion there, which made my job easier. So, as much fun as it can be to dunk on these movies, and as much as they suck, I want to come out against anyone pointing to my script and saying, see, they should have just done it like this. Because it isn't that simple, and that's not fair to the hard work that those creators did. Also, who knows? Maybe you don't like my version. I've made some deviations from the text, and I can't expect them to work for everyone, even though I stand by them. I hope you guys do like it, though. As I was writing it, I started questioning if there was any larger purpose to doing so. It was a learning experience, and I got to write the version of these movies that I wanted to see, but I questioned whether it was really worth the time. And what I came to was that I know this story means a lot to other people too, and that most of us were very disappointed by the adaptation we got. So I hope that the version I've created here is not just better than the one we got, but is also good in itself and meaningful to people, because those aren't the same thing. And even if nobody asked me to do this, I still feel some responsibility to do a good job with it and not just be totally indulgent with my adaptation. So I hope I accomplished that. Also, I'll say that even though adapting something comes with a lot of challenges, it's also much easier when you have a lot of the major story work done for you. I didn't spend that much time outlining or doing character work like I normally do when I come up with an original story. The planning phase took a fraction of the time it normally does. I don't plan to adapt anything else unless it's for a job, but it's definitely helpful to have a source material to fall back on and reference when you're feeling a little bit stuck. And finally, I was able to rediscover my love for a story that I've been a fan of since I was like 4 years old, and come to a newfound appreciation of it. There are, of course, flaws in the original text that I've talked about, but on the whole, this is a really wonderful story, and I feel like some of its themes became clear to me throughout this process in a way that they never had before. And I'm going to leave it there. If you're new here, we have other video essays on this channel, a lot different from this one, but I try to make them good. And we also have a podcast channel where we're going to be discussing An Unexpected Journey very soon, and shortly after that, we'll be doing a joint episode on Desolation of Smaug and Battle of the Five Armies on our Patreon. We haven't recorded those yet, but I'm sure it'll be a good time. And if you wanted me to slam on the movies more in this video than I did, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of that. I can't speak for my co-host, but personally, I am preparing a scathing rant of Alfred for that episode because holy crap, I hate that guy. Not the actor, just the character. I'll leave the actor out of it. As I mentioned, the full versions of both of my scripts are available for you to read. The link for that is in the description. I'm probably not going to do a full rewrite like this with anything else, although if I do, it's probably going to be with Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End, because that's another movie that I really want someone to take a second crack at. If anybody wants to be a big hero and redo the end of Game of Thrones, be my guest and send it to me when you're done, but I know I am not up to that task. Otherwise, thank you to our patrons for supporting the show, and thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.